Welcome to the Project Censored Show on Pacifica Radio. I'm your host, Mickey Huff, with Eleanor Goldfield. Today on the program, as we enter 2026, we welcome back media scholar Nolan Higdon, political analyst, author, and host of the Disinfo Detox podcast. He's a lecturer at Merrill College in the Education Department at University of California, Santa Cruz. He is a Project Censored national judge. Higdon's areas of concentration include critical AI literacy, podcasting, digital culture, news, media, history, and propaganda, including critical media literacy, pedagogy, and education. All of Higdon's work is available at his Substack, nolanhigdon.substack.com. He is the author or co-author of numerous books, including The Anatomy of Fake News, Let's Agree to Disagree, United States of Distraction, The Media and Me, Surveillance Education, and more. He is also a regular expert on media issues for CBS, NBC, the New York Times, and the San Francisco Chronicle. Coming out of the San Francisco Bay Area, Nolan Higdon, welcome back to the Project Censored Show today.
Mickey Huff, it is a pleasure. And with that introduction, I don't think I could live up to it. So I think we can just call it a show there. That works.
Well, let's just call it a show, and we'll go to the White House feed and we'll just tell our folks whatever the great leader wants us to tell everybody. Speaking of great leaders, Donald Trump, according to Wikipedia, is also now the president of Venezuela. So speaking of Venezuela, Nolan, in one of your recent pieces for your Gaslight Gazette, Faking It Till We Break It, Silicon Valley's Useful Idiots from Maduro to Minnesota, is your January 12th piece, available at nolanhigdon.substack.com. You begin the piece by talking about the Maduro kidnapping or abduction or whatever terminology we're supposed to use. I don't think we're allowed to say either of those things. I know the BBC said that we weren't allowed to talk about it that way. But Nolan, let's dive in here. And you start with a great tweet from the media scholar and journalist Alan McLeod, who talks a lot about bogus headlines, propaganda, and disinformation. But kick us off here, Nolan. Give us some of the analysis you have over what was happening there.
Yeah, and I echo that. I mean, Alan McLeod's a good follow. So if you're out there in the social media world, highly encourage you to give him a follow. Yeah, I mean, this really started out. I started writing an article about all the AI content that was coming out after President Trump's extraordinary rendition of Venezuelan President Nicolas Maduro. And, I saw how the content, a lot of it was trying to appeal to US audiences to support what we had done, this potential war crime, this potential violation of the US Constitution, and so on. There were these videos of Venezuelans crying and celebrating that were completely AI generated. And it wasn't necessarily, obviously, you and I have been doing this a long time. I wasn't shocked there was false content out there. It wasn't news to me that people were generating AI content. But really what drew my attention was how much of this stuff had been flagged as fake. And people were still sharing it because it was getting them likes and clicks, especially content creators. And so I was in the midst of writing kind of a draft of this. And then, of course, we had the horrendous event that happened in Minnesota where Renee Good was killed by an ICE agent. And I already had this, idea for this article floating around in my head. And I watched it happen all over again, less than a week later around Minnesota. All these AI generated videos, these falsehoods that were for clicks, people were sharing stuff. And I thought, okay, I could chronicle kind of these events, but what does it really say about where we're at here in the moment? We know false content exists. We know that people try to appeal to audience emotions to get them to support something they otherwise wouldn't support. But I want to drill down on all the perverse incentives of the digital world that make these so-called content creators and influencers really just not even care that the stuff is false, right? And not even care that they were caught or that people know it's false. The clicks superseded. And to me, there's just kind of a sociopathic tendency there that I wanted to draw audiences' attention to.
Well, I mean, I don't think we can call enough attention, in fact, to what's happening. In fact, the way you start the article, you're pointing out that one of the videos showing Maduro allegedly torturing Venezuelan dissidents that had 15 million views and 81,000 likes right after it was posted, it was a scene from a movie.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, this is the kind of nonsense that we're getting at. It's not just Sora and this kind of it's literally just posting things that are literally fiction. They're not even made to be AI, right? And so I think that gets into the mechanics of deception. let's talk a little bit more on, I mean, again, we can get into some of the stories, whether it's Venezuela or Minnesota, and we have plenty of time to get into some of these things. But let's talk about the mechanics of deception. Let's talk about artificial intelligence. We're not talking about real intelligence, clearly. It's obviously the latest tool in the big tech toolbox, right? And it's being pushed upon the public willy nilly almost at every turn across the professions. Let's talk a little bit about this. You have some really great analysis in here about how AI has actually complicated the problem of disinformation. And you mentioned going back 70 years, that the dreams of how this could happen and could be a possible force for good. But here we are when clearly there are far more examples that we can point to where AI driven content is just a nightmare.
Yeah, and 70 years ago, when engineers were sort of and theorists were sort of talking about AI, they were actually thinking about like, could we define human intelligence in a way where then we could then replicate it, and that was sort of like the theoretical framework for it. And more or less, by the mid 20th century, certainly by the 1970s, most people had kind of given up on that concept. It was pretty reductive, first of all, for defining intelligence. And secondly, it was something that just didn't, seem possible. Silicon Valley, though, they really know how to brand. Obviously, they've co-opted ideas like social or democracy or community and things like that, and made a lot of money. And so they took these new large language models, which basically can be trained to learn patterns and replicate them. And they called it artificial intelligence, but that's not what artificial intelligence is. And folks like Gary Smith have pointed out this is why there's always new versions coming out of ChatGPT or Gemini or what have you. Each new version is a clear reminder that they failed to create intelligence. That's why they have another version of it coming out so quickly. But in terms of the fake news problem, what I wanted to point out in the article is there's sort of two issues here. I mean, they're closely related in both AI, but I think sometimes talk about them or don't talk about them separately enough. One is that folks are going to these AI bots to get information, but all they do is recognize patterns. And so there's been study after study at this point that basically the best AI bots might be right one every two times. And just really sit with that for a second, because imagine if Mickey opened up this interview and said, yeah, Nolan, everything he says, about half of it's right. Would you still be listening right now? Right? I mean, it's absurd. But folks are using it for very serious issues like medical advice or career advice or investigations,
Turning in their term
legal help.
paper.
Yeah, we know all too much about that. So that's certainly, and well, on that point, right? Like news agencies are using it
Yeah.
to summarize content. So that's one issue with kind of the disinformation. The other side is these tools allow us to do things that, I mean, propagandistic regimes only dreamed of. You can make slick looking videos in seconds, that where you can replicate something happening that didn't happen, that can fit any predetermined narrative you want. That's really dangerous, because obviously it can lead otherwise good people to do bad things based on this bad information. But it's also dangerous because of the environment we have, which is the money that is made in the digital environment comes from clicks. And clicks are usually driven by things that appeal to fear and hate. So with something like Venezuela or something like what happened in Minnesota to Renee Good, there's a lot of hate, there's a lot of fear, a lot of uncertainty, a lot of confusion. That's where fake news really thrives. And you can come in with AI and create content really quickly that draws people's attention and gets that clicks. And if you're such a sociopath that you only care about the clicks, which turn into money, and don't care about truth or the repercussions, such as like, the end of social cohesion, it can really be a huge problem for our country. And that's kind of what I was speaking to in the article.
Yeah, it's an absolute calamity for a democratic republic that relies on an informed public to be meaningfully civically engaged. You write in your article, AI bots are prone to getting things wrong and fabricating information. One study put AI bot summaries were inaccurate nearly half the time, as you just said. Other studies found AI fabricating information 66 to 80% of the time. These are significant numbers. 20% of videos you write shown on new YouTube users are AI slop. And you write, quote, meaning low quality, mass produced, algorithmically generated content designed to maximize clicks and watch time rather than to accurately inform the public, this is quite riveting. Nolan, not even 8 years ago, we at Project Censored, and you wrote about this too. We wrote about a technologist named Aviv Ovadia who wrote about the coming infocalypse. I'm allowed to say that on air, FCC. It's an infocalypse. I mean, we could easily call it some other things, but at any rate, Avadia was warning back in 2018 that the tech sector was already on the verge of being able to replicate images, audio, the degree to which that it was rough, but we were on the cusp of being able to create whole cloth, something that looked like somebody and sounded like somebody that was completely fabricated, right? And he was warning about it then. And I remember because we were giving a lot of talks then. You and I were putting together the United States of Distraction book that came out in 2019. And for a lot of folks, that was kind of a step too far, right? It was like, oh, we'll always be able to know, and there'll be guardrails and ethical guidelines and watermarks. And well, here we are with Sora 2. I mean, here we are with everything that Ovadia said not only has come true, but it is even harder to detect than he even suggested.
Yeah, and also, while we're on the history lesson here, right? Back then, the big talking point was, we're going to pressure big tech to take down the content. We put so much of our faith in the future of these big tech platforms to remove the content, and now look
Now they're
who's in
running
charge
it.
of these platforms. Yeah, like
They're
I mean,
pushing the
Elon Musk
content.
is making a fortune off this so-called AI revolution. Right now, he's got a new Grok program that he's drawing a bunch of clicks on because it allows you to undress women and children.
Yeah.
And we're allowing again big tech to regulate itself, and that was something we raised issue about over the last decade. But to your point about how and Vadia's point about how quick this is advanced, I was listening to Yanis Varoufakis,
Yeah.
the former financial minister of
Happened to
Greece.
him. Happened to him.
Yeah, and he said interestingly, he had to watch some of the videos for like 2 minutes to figure out whether or not it was AI generated because it was saying things that he would say, but he finally figured out that in one of the videos, I guess he has multiple locations where he stays. He was wearing a shirt that was at a different location than where he was staying. That's how he knew it was false. And that's him watching himself.
Himself.
Yeah,
Yeah.
that's
It's like reminding me of like Cambridge Analytica's 5,000 data points on every American voter. I don't know 5,000 data points about myself, and I'm me. I mean, this is the ridiculous name. I mean, we have totally jumped the shark here. But this is all out in the public. This is all out in consumer commercial culture and society. This is on the tethering devices that everybody carries around and listens to everything we say, and it's all beamed at us. I mean, it's Aldous Huxley's worst nightmare on steroids, right? I mean, again, it's insane the kind of things that we're seeing right now. You also go on to talk about Section 230. Let's remind our listener. This comes up over and over again in a lot of these discussions about holding tech companies accountable and the spread of fake news. Remind our listeners what is you write about the shield of immunity, and remind our listeners what is Section 230 and how is it coming up again here when it's talking about AI, disinformation, and these types of things around regulation. Nolan Higdon.
Yeah, and Section 230 of the Communications Act from the 1990s was a product of the politics of the time, which were very favorable for corporations. And essentially, you had these people, these tech platforms were getting sued for things that third parties had posted, right? So some user had posted something on a website and someone didn't like what was said, so they sued the platform. And some of the platforms edited their comments, others did not. And the courts had originally ruled, well, if you edit your comments or you regulate them, that means you're like an editor, like a newspaper, so you can be sued. But Congress thought, like, no, that's not fair. Like, people are trying to moderate shouldn't get in trouble. So what we'll do is we'll shield them. Basically, these platforms cannot be sued for things that users post on the platform. What that led to was it created a new industry that folks now know as social media, because all these, big money said, okay, hold on a second. We have these platforms where people can say whatever they want. We can't get in trouble for it. We can use whatever mechanisms we want to keep them addicted to the platform and make a boatloads of cash off their data. Excellent. And that's what developed. And so now in the age of AI, people are creating content that's way more convincing, way more dangerous, and the platform can't get sued, but it's the platform that's bringing it to everybody. So if you and I, whatever, create some AI video, we really need the social media platforms to spread it. We need their algorithm to spread it. If we're ever going to reach a large audience. And so they're making boatloads of cash off this. They're incentivizing users to create this type of content. And it's only the people who are, victims of the outcome of the video who are held accountable. The actual platform itself is not. And that's something I was pointing to in the article, that simply this need to change way before the invention of so-called AI, but certainly needs a change in this era.
This goes back a while. These laws are outdated, and the technology, again, this is not a new issue as far as the technology goes out, it goes out into the culture, the corporations control it, they profit from it, and government struggles at best to try to keep up with it for optics. I mean, it never is able to keep up or keep pace to what happens. By the time the government does do anything meaningful in terms of regulation, there's already loopholes either built in or they're already moved on, to whatever the next paradigm is or whatever the next big tech issue is. Let's go into some other details here. Let's go into a few other things. We know that. Let's turn to the tragedy in Minnesota briefly. We know that Jonathan Ross shot at point blank range and killed Renee Good. But online, again, that we know. And even if we try to agree on facts, the way in which things have diverged and been interpreted, and then the kind of slop that's been generated, the deep fakes to kind of support certain narratives, particularly. Well, I'll let you finish that rather than say what side's doing what here. But again, one of the big images that went around was using AI to unmask this person, Jonathan Ross. But let's talk a little bit more about how we're seeing weaponized AI around these political issues.
Yeah, and I think an important context and something I brought up in the article, it's, I remember way back in September of 2025 when Charlie Kirk was murdered. And there was, supposedly this national discussion about how we need to take the temperature down and stop the hyper-partisan narratives around these tragic events. That's just completely been wiped away by the time of the Renee Good, murder. And you can point to, and I do in the article, that, folks who are critical of ICE immediately tried to unmask Jonathan Ross. Again, since you're unmasking and putting a fake mask, a fake face up there, was that really about getting ICE, or was that really about getting clicks? This is that's kind of sociopathic narrative we talked about, but I mean, that doesn't hold a candle to the supporters of ICE, including those in the federal government, who immediately reacted. Donald Trump, immediately claiming that that Renee Good tried to ran over this officer and claimed the officer was in the hospital. And members of his administration backed up that claim, when clearly the video, one, he didn't get ran over, two, he wasn't sent to the hospital, he walked away. And then it really seemed like that he was in a meeting with the New York Times shortly thereafter. And it looked like after he had made that statement, that's when the New York Times showed him the video of what happened. So it looked like he was just kind of already talking without having seen the video. And meanwhile, members of his administration, like Vice President J.D. Vance, are saying that this person has immunity, and they're calling her a domestic terrorist. And all these things, again, there's evidence that undermines some of these claims. A lot of these other claims are absolutely baseless. And it seems to be counter to what we talked about with Charlie Kirk, right? When Charlie Kirk died, conservatives were saying, hey, his wife is grieving. This is a tragedy. Let's not feed into this. Well, Renee Good's wife, an orphan child, are grieving right now as well. But, the same sort of grace wasn't extended to them. And I think the just hypocrisies and double standards throughout the last 6 months from Charlie Kirk to this event are just, astounding. And I also would be remiss if I didn't note that this happened just a day after the anniversary of January 6th.
That's right.
Yeah, when Donald Trump pardoned the people who went to the Capitol and claimed that the law enforcement that shot at them, including killing Ashley Babbitt, he called them thugs.
Thugs, right.
But the exact opposite is true here. Or conservatives defend, and they did so on the anniversary, defend the idea that Trump did not create a context for this to happen. These people acted on their own accord. You can't blame someone like Trump for individuals' actions. But then they seem to blame blame leftists for what happened to Renee Good and her wife, arguing they created this environment where it was bad for ICE and it created this whole environment. So the double standards are just astounding throughout. And I wanted to document those in the article because I don't know. I, like a lot of people, sort of sided with this kind of argument that we should, be able to critique Charlie Kirk's work, but we should, I think, be cognizant of when, us, the nation, are grieving someone, and if we raise this tension, it can be bad. I thought that was actually a good message that we should apply everywhere, but of course, within a few months, the nation seems to have memory hold that.
Well, again, one of my favorite George Carlin quotes, as you actually put in the piece, as Carlin once quipped, let's not have a double standard here. One standard will do just fine. And he was talking about euphemisms in that part of his stand-up routine from the early 90s about how the CIA doesn't kill anybody, they just neutralize people or they clear the area, right? He was talking about it then decades ago, and we see the same kind of hyperbolic euphemistic language often used here by the Trump administration, right? And we now have seen more of even a doubling down, Nolan. There are more now. Now there are more ICE agents being sent to places like Minneapolis. I mean, this is absolutely preposterous. And by the way, it's at a time when the government's own violent crime statistics show that violent crime is down in the country. These folks also love to forget that Bill Clinton deported 2 million people and Obama deported 3 million people and nobody got shot in the face. I mean, I know if we
And he
go
was
back
known as the
far,
deporter in chief. Yeah.
yeah, I know exactly. I mean, if we go back
Yeah.
far enough, we can see Dick Cheney shooting his lawyer in the face, but that's another subject for another time. Nolan, you conclude in your piece that we really do need higher standards, ones that we can all adhere to, that we need to prioritize evidence, right? Not engagement. Let's talk a little bit about how can critical media literacy education ameliorate some of these issues, or how can we, and we teach these things in the classroom, what are some things that we can do to bring out of the classroom into the world where we can help people understand how these tools are being used, whether or not we should be using them at all. There was another interesting statistic that you included in your piece that said that roughly 90% of US citizens have access to smartphones and 62% use so-called artificial intelligence. Um, that's extraordinary. And more than half the US public claims they get news from social media, which is dominated by algorithms to create echo chambers. So, putting on our critical media literacy hats, our solutions journalism hats momentarily, what are some things that you advocate for people to do as somebody that is a scholar of AI literacy?
I think we've talked a lot of years about some fact checking things that still apply about knowing or trying to identify who created the content, what its message is, what evidence supports it, what alternative evidence or narratives are out there. I think those kinds of things are still important questions to ask. But I think one of the things I wanted to raise in this article that we need to think about adding, and I know folks like Elliot Cohen have talked about this for a long time, but uh, ethics in media as well. And that goes for these media producers, these folks who are creating content online. Like, look, people get things wrong. And, I've gotten things wrong in my life too. That's not what I'm talking about. I'm talking about who purposely or knowingly create false content or knowingly purposely continue to spread false content purely for profits. That's simply just unethical. And, I don't know if there's a legal way to do that by protecting the rights that we hold dear to hold these folks accountable. But at least culturally, this should be something that's shamed. It should be a sense of embarrassment for any kind of sophisticated culture. I think it would really help to also talk about regulation, breaking up a lot of these big media outlets, these so called social media outlets and so called AI companies, and breaking them up with the goal of having less concentration of data, less concentration of power, and regulating their business model. This idea that just anything that gets clicks and makes money is good to go needs to end. This is one of the things I really wanted to point out in the article. We've tried this experiment now for 30 years. This is the outcome. It's literally insanity to keep doing the same thing over and over again and expecting different results. We need to take action, I think, on an education front, on a cultural front, and certainly on a government regulation front if we want to have anything that resembles a democracy moving forward.
Yeah, absolutely, Nolan Higdon. And going back to Bill Clinton in the 1996 telecom bill, and the promotion of the internet as this great technology of the future from the 1990s. We had what was called the super information highway. It's totally turned into the super disinformation highway. And it's a disinformation highway running off a cliff. If you want to keep that going. Nolan, one last bit here, and I want you to share where people can follow you and find more information about you. But you do, of course, talk about classroom capture, and we talk about education as being one of the antidotes to these challenges. However, the very places where we try to teach them are inundated with big tech money, and everybody's scrambling after the latest AI technology. And so criticism of AI on campuses is often frowned upon by administrators and rarely gets a fair hearing at the table where decisions are made about tech adoption. Nolan Higdon.
Yeah, I mean, like all other public institutions, higher education has been captured by corporate interests, certainly over the last 30 years. And one of the downstream effects of that is that the people that it produces, not everybody, but overwhelming amounts of people, have a really favorable interpretation of corporations and a corporate view of the world. And they're the ones who come back into the classroom. They become the administrators, they set the policy. And so a lot of these, unfortunately, higher education institutions operate like corporations and in favor of corporations. And for those folks who are more critical and do see the problems we've talked about here, they're up against a big population of people who really want to bring all this AI and big tech corporatism into the classroom, even openly replacing humans. Like the California State University, the biggest university system, just signed a huge contract with OpenAI, which makes ChatGPT to integrate AI throughout the curriculum. Yeah, I think this is a fight. I think students and faculty need to bound together. They need to recognize that the administrative managerial class are their enemies, and the corporations they serve are as well. And we need to do everything we can to get them off campus, get them out of the classroom, and let the educators, who are the professionals, dictate the type of pedagogy moving forward.
Couldn't agree more, Nolan Higdon. And I wanted to close our session with a great quote from our friend Jonathan Swift from 1710. And I think some folks are familiar with it, but only recall the first line. Let me do the whole paragraph as it so unfortunately aptly predicted where we're going. Actually, talked about a problem in his own time that is now just completely off the rails. And Swift wrote, falsehood flies and truth comes limping after it, so that when men come to be undeceived, it is too late. The jest is over, and the tale hath had its effect. Like a man who hath thought of a good repartee when the discourse is changed, or the company parted, or like a physician who hath found out an infallible medicine after the patient is dead. Nolan Higdon, I think we're pretty much on life support, but I hope we're not dead yet. We need all the help we can get with critical media literacy education, and are grateful for all the work that you do. Where can people find your work, Nolan Higdon?
Thank you very much, Mickey Huff. They can find it at nolanhigdon.substack.com. That's where you can go to sign up for the Gaslight Gazette. Like Mickey said, it'll come right to your email. I'll update whatever stories are going on, breaking news. Also got the Disinfo Detox. You can get that there as well, which is a podcast unwrapping a lot of these issues. And thank you so much, Mickey, for having me on, and appreciate the Project Censored universe. And Project Censored does such great work. Thank you so much.
Nolan Higdon, it's a pleasure to have you here. I'm glad that you're still doing such great work, and you're doing things when you can with us at Project Censored. You're also going to be partnering with us at the Park Center for Independent Media, working with some students, doing work around critical media literacy there, and around fake news. So we're in detection of fake news. So we're definitely looking forward to more of that. And I'm sure you'll be back on the program sooner than later. Thanks again for joining us on the Project Censored Show.